Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this insightful discussion. We are welcoming Michael Benhamou. Mr. Benhamou is Executive Director of OPEWI, Europe's War Institute, whose goals are to bring tactical and technical insights to policymakers as well as to spark a mental change on defense within European public. He also serves as a reserve officer in the French Army, as a political advisor at the Joint Forces Command. He was formerly deployed in NATO and EU operations and exercises on land, at sea, within air headquarters, such as in Kosovo, Afghanistan, GCC, and Libya. His bold proposal will explore the Europeanized NATO, and it will address a pivotal shift in global defense dynamics, especially as the US faces increasing demands on its resources. Today, we will explore how this transformation could shape the future of NATO, the challenges it might present, and the potential impact on the transatlantic security. So, before handing over the floor to Mr. Benhamou, so if you have comments and questions, please include them in the comment section so we can see and answer them. So, Mr. Benhamou, thank you for joining us again. The floor is yours.
Many thanks for this kind invitation. Can you see the presentation? Can you see
Uh,
it fine?
no, okay, now we see that. Now we're able to see.
Fine.
Okay. Yes, we're going to start in NATO fashion with a couple of slides on what is meant behind the term Europeanizing NATO to save it. This presentation is drawn from a paper that was written in Defense One with Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council. Over the past year, with Rachel, we tried to think about what NATO's future, might be, and so this presentation is uh, a consequence of that. Um, and so I will now go through it, and then we can have a chat about what you think about this. I think first we need to start about deep trends, and before we go into the proposition itself. Um, First, for the next 20, 25 years, it seems that military affairs are going to be defined by three elements. The fact that we have increasing costs with climate change and with energy prices, the scarcity also of minerals, which is impacting the army quite a lot. We see that in Ukraine right now, and China still rising as a peer competitor to the US. And so that leads, I think, many actors to believe that violence is better than cooperation. Unlike the end of the 20th century, the 21st century seems to be a moment when zero-sum games are back. But fortunately, we have four counter trends to that violence, which I think are, in a way, containing violence. The fact that global populations are getting old, also, that we have more and more urbanization, which is slowing down military operations for sure. Parity between the two new blocks that we have in this century, the US Europe bloc on the one hand, and the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea bloc on the other. And fourth, high budget constraints. We have actually less budget maneuver in this century than in the last, where you had 2%, 3% growth, a lot. We don't have that in this century. And so two consequences. The first one is that wars tend to be slow, protracted, and of mid-intensity, and defense maneuvers will matter a lot, unlike in the last century, where offensive maneuvers were essential. And the second consequence is that local operations are going to be more recurrent than international coalitions, such as the ones we saw at the beginning of the century. And I was a part of it, for example, ISAF in Afghanistan, NATO in Afghanistan, which at some point had 50 nations, 50. This is obviously not something that we are seeing now, and I don't think we'll see that anytime soon. Geography is back. That is the final result, consequence of all this. And so political leaders right now are being asked by citizens to think regional instead of global and to try to tame, to control for supply chain issues, international dependencies. Uh, we are entering a different world than the last century. America's global presence is changing accordingly. In the last century, as you can see in this wonderful graph by Michael Allen and colleagues, as you can see, the moment when Asia became more important than Europe in terms of US overseas personnel, US military troops deployed abroad, that moment was 2008. Barack Obama, with his pivot to Asia, has only coined and put a term, an expression behind a decision that the American bureaucracy, that the American military establishment had already made in 2005, 6, 7. And that trend continues today. As you can see,
Mr.
I don't think you
Benhamou,
can.
Mr. Benhamou, can I interrupt, please? Is it possible to switch to other slides if you want, because it's still in the first slide. So I don't know if you need to switch to other slides, but if you can, the audience can also follow.
I don't know. I'm doing what I can with what you have given me. I am on the third slide, and it doesn't work. You don't see the military presence slide? No?
No, we're still seeing the first slide. Let me see.
Yeah, no, no. So I will try again.
Yeah, you can try again to see if this works.
Can you
Yeah, now
see
see exactly. Good.
you
Thank
see
you.
the right one? Yeah.
Yeah. So can you switch to next slide to see if it is working, just to test?
But okay, now I'm going back. Okay, now you see the right slide, right? You see the right
We
yeah?
see
Are we
we
good?
see the global military presence since 1950 slide.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that is
That's
the
the
one.
one. Okay. All right. Good. Thank you very much.
So America back in the 90s had 300,000 troops in Europe, and now the figure is 100,000 troops. So America has gone down, has diminished its presence in Europe by 60, 70%. Not really in favor of Asia. Asia is going up if you add up East Asia, South Asia. But the overall trend, America's overseas presence is a decline. It's troops going back home instead of being sent away. For Europe, I don't know if you can see this slide, this new slide, America's military presence in Europe. Can you see it? Yeah.
I don't. No, we don't see this one. So you switch the slide and talk about Europe, but we still see the global military presence. Okay, now we see that. Good. So now we see that. Good. Thank you very much.
All right. I will do it this way then. Okay, so basically the countries which are impacted in Europe by this are the UK, Germany, Italy, Turkey, of course, and Spain. Um, but this is pre-Ukraine, and so now America's military presence in Europe has shifted east at the expense, especially of Germany, but also, I believe, of the UK. What is going on between America and Europe? Many people talk about it, but I think there is a lot of taboo about this conversation. The number one element to consider is demographics. It's the fact that when the NATO treaty was signed between Europe and the US, America was 90% white from European descent. In 20 years, America will be 45% white from European descent. And so the establishment, diplomats, and the military in Washington is going to change accordingly. You're going to see a rise of Hispanics, of Latinos, of African Americans, of Asians, more and more influencing, driving America's foreign policy towards their regions of origin, exactly like the WASPs, the Protestants, have done with Europe. This is something that Brookings is discussing right now, and that I think is quite commonsensical. Where the relationship between the US and Europe is still very strong, but the weight of Europe's trade still is declining compared to America's overall import and export trade. This is especially true for goods. In 1950, after World War II, uh, goods exchange with Europe was 40% of all goods exchange of America. Now it is between 20 and 25%. Some people are saying that this figure does not include services and FDI, foreign direct investments. That is true, and I think we need more work on this. But I would counter argue that America's trade openness is still not as strong as other European countries. America is more self-sufficient than many European countries. Still, trade is essential for America. And last but not least, America's troop presence. So troop presence compared to other parts of the world, I mean, this is, as you can see here in green, evolving a lot, depending on wars, depending on threats. But, during the Cold War, 70% of US overseas troops, 70% were in Europe. And now it is closer to 35%. And Ukraine has not changed that proportion, that ratio. So bottom line, I think we need more data, and I don't see any right now on what America's new communities think about NATO. What do Latino think about NATO? What do African Americans think about NATO? Asians? No one is working on this, and we need more work also on America's business exposition to Europe compared to other parts of the world. That leads me to the proposition that we made with Rachel recently, Europeanizing NATO. So what does this mean? I think we have right now three options for Europe. You can choose to be an ostrich, option one. You choose to be a beaver, or you can choose to be a hyena. Um, Ostriches are usually people who tell you that Trump is an exception, that the feeling of rule of law and democracy is going to bond Europe and America forever, and that we should not do anything that will annoy American leaders. This is option one. Option two is those like me who believe that something is going on in America, which goes beyond Donald Trump, and that we should try to build something new to avoid a complete divorce, and so to ensure maximum deterrence for Europe in the long term. And you can be also option three. You can wish to go back to the 19th century, basically, where national interests prevailed over coalitions, even a European coalition. And you can believe that we should go back to old bilateral alliances, and some countries would then side with the US, other countries would side with Russia, for example. Everyone for himself. These are the three options we have on the table right now. And I will, of course, try to develop option two with you today, very quickly in just 2 slides. So I don't have a lot of slides. It's almost over. So as a beaver, for the next 20 years, what would it mean to be a European military? First of all, it means asking the US for a bipartisan deal on the evolution of NATO, with Republicans and Democrats trying to sit at the table and say, okay, what how do you value Europe? What is the value that you put on Europe over the medium term? And what is how many troops can we expect also from you to be stabilized on the European continent? I believe this is something that can really be done, where you may find a consensus in Washington D.C. And we need that clarity in Europe. Because we don't have that clarity, we cannot plan right now ahead our deterrence and our responses to threats. Because everything we do in Europe is based on the assumption that America is going to intervene forcefully, which we know is not really true anymore. And so this is a very dangerous moment for Europe, because we are basing our military responses on something which is incorrect. That can change if Americans bring more political clarity on their relationship with us. That would also mean, once we have that clarity, and even before that, that Europeans need to spend more than 2% of their GDP on defense, probably at least 3% of GDP. Some European countries are already doing that. And of course, this is going to determine the future of NATO, because I believe that NATO will stay, and America will still be a part of NATO. But NATO is going to be just more European, with more European commands. And the countries which spend more on defense obviously will have more responsibility in these European NATO commands. A consequence of this is secure. Secure probably is going to become European at some point. Right now, it is an American four-star. But if America continues to withdraw as much as it is withdrawing now, and if Europeans finally raise their military budgets, well, I think at some point it would be fair and reasonable to say, well, now secure should be European, and even de-secure should be European, and Americans would have a backseat chief of staff kind of role. And that would be the case for all NATO commands. For example, Naples. We can imagine Naples, which right now commands the Mediterranean, and which right now is an American four-star. Naples could become a rotating command between European countries. For example, for the composition, you may see a group of 4 or 5 countries: France, Italy, Spain, Greece, Turkey. And then as DCOM, countries who do not have the same weight, but who have who invest a lot in the Mediterranean: Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Portugal, for example, Malta, Cyprus, could be maybe interested in these positions. Americans would be COS or J3, for example. Of all this is to keep Americans engaged at the level where they want to be engaged, uh, with logistics and with intelligence, because obviously we need them in these 2 dimensions where they are very strong. And we also need to make sure that Article 5 remains active and remains credible. So as you can see, this is a complete um, mental shift, which I believe has already started de facto, but that no one is actually talking about because of fears, because of habits, because of biases. And I think this is dangerous, not to face reality, especially in military affairs. My last slide is on KFOR, on NATO forces in Kosovo, because I believe KFOR could be a model for that option too. When I was at KFOR, 2010 and 11, we had 10,000 troops, and America totaled 12% of KFOR in terms of troops at the time. So basically, what you had at KFOR is 90% of European troops. The commander was either German, French, or Italian. DCOM was, when I was there, Austrian or Portuguese, and the chief of staff was a permanent American one-star position, and everything was working fine. We did a lot of good work in Kosovo, and so I believe this is a model that could be replicated and that could become, as we say in NATO language, a potential force design. This is the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening, and now I'm open to any questions you may have. Thank you again, Umit and Mustafa.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. So in this point now we can actually start asking the questions. So if you want, Umit can start, and then I can ask my questions later.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you, Mr. Benhamou, again for being with us today and for the insightful briefing. Mostly today say that the era in which, as then the European Union Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell told in a Georgetown University audience in March, it was almost as if Europeans were saying, "For war, please call the U.S." Maybe nearing its end, as you mentioned. And no matter who wins the U.S. presidential election in November, Washington's attention is shifting to Beijing and the Indo-Pacific, and so Europe could soon face its threats alone, I think. And while Europe has not translated its economic resources and power to geopolitical power at that day, uh, for example, we couldn't keep Moscow in check on our own. As the foreign policy article formulated, the question goes, can Europe ensure its own security and continued prosperity with less support from the United States, and learn how to navigate what Borrell called the forgotten harshness of the world on its own? And one potential, I think, answer today to this question is your offer, the Europeanization of NATO. So regarding the Europeanization of NATO, which aims to make European Union a less dependent, more capable, and more equally allied to the United States, I believe that we are discussing a transatlantic defense, de-risking, but not decoupling. Uh, so it sounds familiar to the European Union's China policy, I think. So um, from that point, overall, continental defense for the Europe will require a mindset shift both to Brussels and to Washington, I think. So my question is about this mindset. NATO's internal tensions are complex and it's ongoing, it's coming from the back. So we know that, but with so many members spread out over such a wide geographical area, these agreements are to be expected. The rise of right-wing, for example, populism in Europe has coincided with a rise in NATO skepticism. So, but still NATO has shown flexibility towards its members in the past and will have to do in the future, I think. But in the light of this discussion, I wonder how the rising influence and divergent political ideologies of the illiberal, like the autocratic democracies within NATO, hinder the Europeanization of NATO project, particularly in aligning defense strategies, shared democratic values, and security dependencies crucial for the European unity and autonomy. And how should Europeanized NATO react to the wave of illiberal, like the autocratic democracies forming within which oppose the ideological standings of the organization to remain relevant for today and prepare for the future? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this question. I think the reason why we have this populism, as you call it, I mean, from the right or from the left, is because Europe is getting poor right now. Purchasing power is going down. In the UK, for example, purchasing power on average has fallen by 10% since 2008. So people feel a certain economic depression. And one of the reasons why we are in this situation is also because we, as you said, we do not control our foreign policy and our defense right now. America is doing this for us. And this has led to an event which is key, which is the destruction of Nord Stream 2 in the Baltics, which has impoverished Germany's industrial capabilities. Right now in Germany, you have a lot of factories closing, and also in the rest of Europe. Gas is now extremely expensive, which is making our products less competitive worldwide. And everything is like that. And we know who conducted this operation in the Baltics. So this has consequences. The fact that we do not really decide what we want to decide or what we could decide as Europeans. The fact that we are in between Russia and the US is making our citizens poorer. And so you have these populist parties on the left and on the right using that and saying, that centrist parties cannot assume power anymore because they don't have any vision of what the future is going to be. America is now playing its own game. Russia is obviously playing a very aggressive game, and no one is in charge of the plane. No one is piloting is at the head of the plane anymore. And so you have this democratic reaction from European citizens saying, okay, I mean, we need to have a new form of leadership. And right now, this populism tends to be helping more right-wing parties, definitely, but you also have strong left-wing parties rising. But it's basically coming from the same assessments that people are making in Europe. We are getting poor. Why? What is going on? And part of what is going on is the conversation we have today. So yes, I believe that NATO is not going to disappear. I believe that Europeans will eventually find a solution together, but it needs to happen fast. The longer we take in breaking taboos, notably about defense, the more expensive financially this is going to be for all of us.
Yeah, I can ask a follow-up question about this. So, like you said, this is happening because of the economic reasons, right? So, how can European countries actually mobilize the people who support, far right, far left ideas? Because at the end of the day, the economy is their priority, right? So, how can European nations, you know, um, create a rally around a flag effect among the people of Europeans so they can support more, stronger leadership role, a stronger
Yeah.
leadership role for European countries. So I understand that, all the economic reasons are out of hands of the European countries, and then it's happening because of the Russia and the United States conflict. But at the end of the day, they need public support in order to exert more authority in NATO, right? So how do you think, like, is if it is feasible for European countries to mobilize public support for a stronger leadership role?
I think it's a good question, but also a very difficult one. I think it's very difficult for mainstream political parties to rise. Why? Because these mainstream political parties, and I was myself a political activist, and I still am in one of these mainstream political parties. We have traditions, we have a history. We have also a box out of which we tend not to that we cannot really leave. We have voters, a certain type of voters, a certain sociology. It's very, very difficult for a political party to switch, from one sociology to another, from one platform to another, and especially for foreign policy. And which is why you have these new political offers coming from the left and from the right, with radical ideas such as negotiating with Russia, or breaking up with the US, or going back to putting police at every border, for example, because these offers are there and they are becoming more and more important, because it's extremely difficult for a politician to say publicly, everything I have told you for the past 20 years or 30 years is a mistake, and we need to do something different. Very, very difficult, because you have a certain fidelity to your ideas, to your values also. And so, which is why it is so difficult to change tactics and policy like this. You find some politicians who are flexible in their minds, and left-wing politicians going extreme left, and right-wing politicians going extreme right. You see that in France, you see that in Germany, in many, many countries. And but generally, this is something that is very difficult, and that is helping new leaders, new political leaders rising from these populist margins, as we call it.
All right. So in this point, Umit can ask
Yeah.
another question. Then I can complete that.
My second question is about the time needed and the environment expected for your NATO, Europeanized NATO. Let me say, during the days when the NATO changed its capacity-based defense planning to, after decades, and turned back to the threat-based capacity planning, which is probably more expensive and time-consuming, the strategic compass, the European Union's autonomy, the new NATO, Green Deal, etc., are very popular rhetoric among the European Union institutions, academia, even the armies. So my question is, we are talking about a 25 years project at a time when China is written by name in official statements on the possibility of conflict between China and the US in the Pacific are made after another for the year 2027, and the war in the Middle East today has an imminent potential to evolve into a significant global war, and even near future is unpredictable. So actually, so we must consider all these factors when planning for the future. Then, what kind of environment do you think we will be facing especially in Europe, during the realization of this project for the next 25 years? And will it be peaceful, confrontational, or warlike environment? And how do you think this will affect your project? At the same time, the second part of this question goes to the time we needed. There was little discussion about the time we needed to realize this project, because 25 years is almost a long time. War has returned to the Europe since 2 years, and Europeans are still unprepared to meet the challenge of protecting the continent without the help of the European help of the United States. So, beside all strategies, allocated funds, lessons learned, etc., does the European Union have enough time to build, for example, an industrial capacity for a combat credible and combat capable legitimate fighting forces before it is needed to take more responsibility and the lead in the NATO just mentioned in the Europeanized NATO project? Do we have
Thank you
time?
for this question. I think if we have a plan, a 20-year plan, this is enough, especially industries need 20 years. As you know, military weapons take 20 years from R&D, research and development, to implementation on the battlefield. So if we give ourselves 20 years of transition with the Americans, I think we can do it. But we need a wake-up call, and we need to tell European citizens that now and we have to pay for it, which we did not have to for the past 80 years. But we need Americans to say it, and to say it also to our citizens. Otherwise, this is not going to work. You talked about the EU. I think the EU has a role here. You talked about the strategic compass. I think that this compass failed to anticipate what is happening in Ukraine. He talked about the focus is global governance and also cyber attacks and what we see with Ukraine and with Gaza is actually a return of conventional fighting and high intensity warfare. And so obviously this compass will need to be updated, but whether it is updated or not, the problem of the EU is unanimity rule at the Council. And I've seen that myself when I was in Kosovo. You cannot make a decision when you work for an EU mission. You cannot make any decision without having unanimity of every European countries. This is making decision making impossible for a military force. So right now, NATO remains the best option we have as a vehicle. The EU is not ready for a real military operation. But I still believe that the EU should start thinking about force design, about task distribution between Europeans, and EUMS is already doing that. I think it's fair, it's good that the EU is organizing this conversation with the EDA, with DG DEFIS, for example, to think about how can we share the load in terms of capabilities and in terms of missions. But I believe that at some point these efforts will be merged into European NATO, and I think it would be fair that NATO becomes the sole venue, the sole vehicle for all military affairs for Europeans. Because this duplication between NATO and the EU cannot last for too long. It's exhausting for the military, and our budgets are already constrained. So we cannot afford to have several organizations doing the same thing. So I believe merging this into a NATO that becomes European, like 80%, 90% European, is the best option we have. And then you have the question of what do you do with Turkey, which is a big question for that future European NATO. But we can discuss that later if you want.
So, as speaking to Turkey and other actors, so I would like to bring the other actors to the discussion table because we also have a question from audience about the United Kingdom. This was also related to my question. So, do you think how can European countries get other actors on board for this project, such as United Kingdom? We know that United Kingdom is not uh, historically following the policies to promote the unity of European Union, European countries, or the continental Europe. Also, sometimes involving in some policies, developing policies to weaken Europeans' role in the world politics. Right. We also have Canada, for example. So, what do you think about the what they feel about this project, would they support such a project that European countries will exercise more leadership role in NATO, and how that would affect their role in world politics as well as in NATO operations?
I think it's very difficult to discuss this with the British because they are like Germany in denial about America's internal evolution as a society, and also geopolitical evolution. and so it's difficult for them to discuss it. They don't really want to talk about it, uh, but because they also depend on the Americans quite a lot for on many parameters. But yes, this is the way ahead. It's going to be Europe. I think they feel it. Uh, but this is a tough moment for them. You know, they decided on Brexit, which has cost them dearly, which is now excluding them also from a lot of CSDP, EU CSDP operations, and also from a lot of European defense programs. And they're trying to get back in them, but you know, it's difficult. They have lost a lot of positions, and America has not opened its door, unlike what was said by the Brexiters. America is more and more protectionist. Barriers are still the same with Biden. You know, Biden did not really change the Trump tariffs, trade tariffs. And America remains more and more isolationist, you know, bringing troops back home for internal challenges. Climate change, you see what is happening in Florida today, being devastated by the hurricane, but also troops coming back for Mexico to secure the border with Mexico, for example. So this is a and obviously, as you said, China rising and challenging America's trade positions in Asia. So this is not to the advantage of the UK, which is in a very solitary moment right now. And I'm saying this, you know, not with glee. I am a huge fan of the British. I am inspired by them, by their history, by their fiction, by their politicians. I'm a lover of the UK, but yeah, this is a tough moment for them.
All right, thank you very much. So if I think we can ask one more question, and then if you have time, we can have another question maybe from audience. Yeah.
Yeah, we talk about the mobilization of the public support about for the project, but and we maybe we should talk about the political will for this project a little bit more detail. Continental defense will require, as we said before, a mindset both in Brussels and the Washington. So, what steps could be taken to form a unified coalition of the willing, with the aim of Europeanization NATO in the next 25 years, with a view to safeguarding its future? Could you how could you consider the feasibility of your option to building something new while maintaining the deterrence in the context of a non-united Europe today?
Um, I think Europe is united, you know, still. I mean, you have Viktor Orban on the side, but overall, I mean, Europeans are pretty systematic, you know, in their foreign policy vision towards Russia, towards, for example, you know, also towards the Islamic State, for example. I don't think you see any major divides right now between European states. That may come. That may come if we see a rise, more votes going to the extreme right. But right now, Europe is remains very united. Um, that being said, that process again, as I told you, has already started. For example, take SNMG2. You know, the this summer, the NATO maritime units deployed in the Mediterranean. Well, in SNMG2 this summer, you found only European countries. You know, France, Italy, I think Turkey was part of it, but there were no Americans present in SNMG2. So So this is a process that this Europeanization of NATO, again, has already started on the ground. But yes, it does not have an official diplomatic form yet. Will it have a diplomatic form at some point? I do not know. It will depend on the politicians that we elect in Europe. There is going to be a temptation, probably in the midterm, of some countries siding with Russia or saying that they want to be in between America and Russia. And that may generate a divide between European states. I hope that this divide is not going to be too big. I don't think it will, because we have so much at stake now between Europeans. Our fates, our destinies, with one another. Too much to be distracted even by geopolitics or defense. Sorry. But yes, there is a risk that of real division because of Russia or because of a return of the Islamic State, for example, and countries not agreeing on what is the priority or not agreeing on making deals, on making a deal with Russia, for instance. What would happen if the Americans decided to cut a deal with Russians? You know, what would be our reaction as Europeans? But I believe myself that common sense will prevail, and that we have so much we have shared so much now, currency, trade, institutions, that it's very difficult to just, you know, destroy all that for short-term events. We will find ways for a conversation and make NATO last, I hope, as long as possible. And also, we need to have that unity, because without that unity, we will not secure America's support, you know, to the same extent. We need to show Americans that we are a strong ally, and strong means being united. If we are not able to be united, that will be less incentive for the Americans to invest in that relationship. So we have to be careful as Europeans.
I think it's also an important question. So, you know, there are civil society organizations across Europe, also in the United States, and they may be able to contribute to this discussion over the project you're proposing. So, specifically, what do you think about how might organizations like maybe Navi, for example, contribute to discussions on the Europeanization of NATO project, especially in terms of enhancing the collaboration between European and non-European veterans?
I think what you do is very important, because when you say NATO veterans, you find a lot of European veterans. And I think that term is not present in the European conversation. You know, it is present in the US, but veterans does not mean anything, unfortunately, in Europe. You know, we don't have a lot of respect, as much respect in Europe for soldiers who have been deployed overseas in difficult operations. So I think it's important culturally to import that term in Europe. First of all, bring people together, and have, because you're present in the US, explain to Europeans the reality of the American conversation, because we do not have, I think a lot of people in Europe are blind to what is actually going on in the US, and so we need you to tell us in Europe what is going on. You know, earlier I told you about making polls. You know, making polls about what Latinos are thinking about NATO, what Asians think about NATO. I tried to find that for weeks and weeks. Right now, no one is polling, is making any polls, and this is the future of America. And this And this is also our future as Europeans, you know. This is also why Donald Trump is able to say what he's able to say, you know, that NATO is BS, that we can put it behind us, you know, and the reason why he can say that is because of these evolutions. And maybe Navi can work with other American think tanks there. For example, the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, which is doing a lot of polling, but not on this. Or you could work with the Atlantic Council, also on, for example, on the trade relationship between Europe and the US. You know, what does it mean from an American perspective? You could do a lot to bring clarity in this relationship. And you know, diplomacy. I mean, you need a little of you need some shade for diplomacy to work. You know, you need some secrets. You need some hypocrisy also. But in the military, all of this kills you. And we are entering a world which is more and more about the military, and unfortunately less and less about diplomacy. So we need operational clarity, and Navi could play a role there. I see a couple of questions. Texas relaxed. I like the name. Italy is working together with Japan and the UK on new generation fighter jets. Do
Yeah, if
UK and
you
Italy may already have started diversifying their web of alliances? Hmm.
so if you would like to answer, we have a little bit of time, maybe 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Texas relaxed. Uh, I think the UK is trying to diversify its alliance for the past 10 years. This is Brexit. Brexit was about this, what they call global UK, but unfortunately, global Britain is not compensating for the loss of Brexit. I think post-Brexit trade deals have compensated for 5% of losses of the UK from leaving Europe. So right now, this diversifying strategy is not really working out. And with again with climate change and with the rise of oil, especially of oil, which matters a lot for the military, it becomes too expensive to actually deploy troops too far from your own home base. And climate change is also reinforcing this, you know, because of concerns with carbon emissions. And so, for all of these reasons, I think the notion that you can diversify by aligning yourself with a country which is 6,000, 7,000 kilometers away from your own, this concept is outdated. You know, this is from the 20th century, from the 19th century, and we are in the 21st. As for Italy, Italy, unfortunately, is the country in Europe which has not changed anything since Ukraine in terms of military budget. Italy is now one of the lowest students in the NATO budget class. You know, Italy remains at 1.4% of its GDP for budget, 1.4, and that is making Italy's military position weaker in the Mediterranean and also in NATO. So I don't think Italy could afford, you know, traveling around the world while it is already losing forces in its own union, which is the EU, and also in its own region. I'm a bit worried for my Italian friends. Uh, Question from DPeer88. Thank you very much for the presentation. Can NATO play a role in supporting liberal democracy beyond? Oh, it's the Western brand of the liberal international. I mean, these are big questions, DPeer 88. Again, as I said, I think the future is regional and not global because of natural disasters, you know, the rise of water, the decline of agricultural output, and many climatic phenomenon that did not occur before, which are extremely costly. I think the future for the army, frankly, is this, and also fighting opportunistic regimes who are trying to use that context, declining context, to make territorial gains. Russia is obviously in that camp. So the future is, regional and not international, I believe. As for the end of the Western brand, I don't really think so. Unlike what many people say, I don't really believe in the global South. When you actually look at trade, when you leave out speeches, big statements, and when you actually look at where the money is going, what people do with their budgets, you actually realize that Brazil, India, and all these BRICS countries are still making a lot of business with the West, are still highly dependent on the West for technologies, and that again, you have to distinguish the statements from the actual reality of trade and of diplomatic deals. And there you see that the West is still, I think, leading, even though this leadership is obviously diluted by the rise of China and also by global warming, for sure.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for answering the questions. So it's almost an hour. We can conclude the interview if you want. If there is anything else you want to add, Umit.
No,
Thanks a lot for
thank
the
you.
invitation. Thanks a lot, Umit and Mustafa.
Thank you very much. It was a
Thank you very
fascinating
much.
presentation, and there were some interesting points you also mentioned, such as the demographic change in the United States. I think the making a poll on Latinos, Asians, I think it's definitely a good idea because, as you said, in the over the next 30, 40 years, maybe we will see more presence from these minorities, and then that will shape how what kind of role United States will play in NATO. So thank you very much for the audience also making comments and asking questions. And thank you very much, Mr. Benhamou, for joining us today and then sharing a fascinating presentation about how to Europeanize NATO. And thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you,
Have a good
guys.
day.
See you soon.